nostalgia-soaked end of the year, over-the-top time. It's Heather Hurlburt from the National Security Network.
This is Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and foreignpolicy.com. And yeah, I'm sorry, I was just dabbing my eyes with the tissue because this is the last, this is the last Drezbert. I'm a little sad about this, Heather.
Yeah. I've already delayed us by about 35 minutes because I couldn't face it.
So you're just in the bathroom, I understand it. I was steeling myself for this as well. So this really is the end of an era. The only comfort I have is that I'm sure the 10 hours we've done on Blogging Heads is more than enough to prevent me from ever achieving a Senate confirmable policy position. So
I think the only hope we have, Dan, is that we get nominated as ambassadors to small, obscure places in the same tranche. And so, all of the poor Senate staffers can save time by just watching them together and getting the dirt on both of us at the same time.
That would be awesome. If you could be an ambassador to any small, obscure country, which would it be?
No, you know what? I can't answer that question because I would, by definition, offend them by it having been called small and obscure.
See, you have that instinct. I would automatically answer, which is why I'm just doomed.
Okay, so where do you want to be ambassador, Dan?
If I really had to pick New Zealand, which is not small and obscure, but New Zealand is just awesome. So
no, that's a great one. My dad was a Fulbright scholar there,
yeah.
But no, because my and I also the ambassador thing. The more internet there is, the more connectivity is, the less desirable ambassadorial slots become because you have less and less discretion on the ground. Since Washington can reach out and touch you 24/7, can read everything you can read pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, my rule is small enough that Washington can't be bothered to pay attention to it, but big enough that what you do there actually matters.
So let me think. Then I think the criteria for you would have to be like, what would be the ideal?
I mean, I'd take a really interesting small post-conflict country like Côte d'Ivoire, actually, which is a fascinating potential regional center in a really interesting region where the U.S. is still able to muster significant interests, but to be brutally honest, not enough people in Washington care.
That's true. And so in some way, I see your point. So the sweet spot for you would be a place where an ambassador could actually do something because you're the United States and you're a large country or a large power in a place that is relatively small, and there's a demand for you to do something, but it's low enough on the priority poll so that Washington's not really going to care all that much. That's not bad. Timor-Leste might be another good one.
Yeah. The truth is, I'm enough of a workaholic. The other option is to go someplace where what you do is throw really awesome parties and hang out with really fascinating people, but you don't actually have much decision-making power.
Right.
And that's very appealing to some people. It appeals less to me. I'm not. If I do manage to change the world, it probably won't be through my cocktail parties, although my husband does make a pretty life-changing latke at our annual latke and fruitcake party. Nice.
I have to admit, if that was the criteria, I would probably pick ambassador to the OECD because it's in Paris, and it's an organization rather than a country, and they actually do some relatively interesting stuff. And I know from personal experience, because when I worked at Treasury, I remember this, their wine shop is outstanding.
Well, the trick is you do something like that, and then bang, before you know it, you're the U.S. ambassador to UNESCO, and you suddenly have all this kind of attention and work that you weren't anticipating.
Oh, that's just
and Congress tries to fire you for doing your job. So
okay. Well, all right. So we've got it.
Anyway,
you've got
2011. 2011. What a year it was.
Yes. So this was not this. I have to admit, this is just one of those things where, as an IR scholar, this was just an awesome year. In terms of lots of really, really interesting stuff happening. I think even by March, they had noticed that sort of, in terms of press coverage, international relations was dominating U.S. newspapers to a much greater extent than it was before. And my guess is that didn't change as the year went on. So,
actually, I would guess that it did change because we had a period in the summer and then again at the end of the year, which was kind of nothing but the foolishness on Capitol Hill. So I would say there were peaks and valleys as far as international coverage is concerned.
That's possible, although partially it also depends how you define what international coverage is. Like, for example, with the Euro crisis, fit in that sense. But I'm not so sure because, even by March, Libya starts ramping up. Then Bin Laden is killed. So, there were, and then, of course, there was Kim Jong-il's death. So, there were still high, and Syria, don't forget Syria. So there were high points, as well. But I take your point on the debt deal. So, sort of stepping back, what is your grand takeaway from 2011? if there
so
is.
my great theme for the year, come up with about 20 minutes before this Blogging Head started, is that this year we saw the departure or collapse or incipient collapse of quite a few institutions and individuals that I think collectively none of us were expecting to go away anytime soon. You know, whether it was the Arab autocrats, Bin Laden, Kim Jong-il, the Eurozone, the dominance of nuclear power in Iran, not to mention Germany, Gaddafi.
Gbagbo in Cote d'Ivoire, actually.
Yes, Cote d'Ivoire, Putin's unquestioned dominance in Russia. A whole lot of building blocks of the world we knew a year ago are now gone. And the other frame of that is that in almost every case, both national and international politics proved completely unequal to the task at hand. And that's, you know, it's a critique that we in the U.S. are used to hearing about our particularly broken politics. But as I think I said to you the last time we got together on Blogging Heads, look, global politics are badly broken. Mm-hmm. And that I really, you know, that I think that's going to be, if I move directly into the prediction phase, you know, in 2012, we're going to be faced again and again with places that are broken that we don't know how to fix. We, the world collective, even if the U.S. had its house in order.
Okay, that's not bad. I will counter this somewhat because I agree with you that you know this was a year. I have to admit, if I sort of again go back in sort of time, the year that this reminds me of is 1968, where you had a series of protests and or social movements that sort of swept across the globe, taking different forms, and in some cases, let's say Czechoslovakia brutally put down. In other cases, let's say the United States, it clearly had a demonstrable effect back then. And I think in some ways you're seeing a similar sort of dynamic play out now, and you can argue that a lot more states sort of fell asunder. I mean, you're absolutely right. The number of Arab autocrats. If I told you a year ago today, by the way, the leaders of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt will all be gone. And Yemen. And the leader of Syria doesn't look like he's going to be lasting that much longer. You would have laughed in my face. So that's.
I would have come all the way up to Boston to laugh.
I would have been flattered by that, Heather. So there's no question. I think you're right about that. On the other hand, I'm not sure if this reflects. There's also part of me that wonders. There's always a danger when we have these kinds of years where there's a tendency to equate, let's say, what happened in Tunisia or what's happening in Egypt with, for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy movements in the United States, or the riots in London. Or for that matter, things going on in Russia and even China. There are times where I would argue that we might have sort of hit the peak of these kinds of populist movements. And 2012 might be more of a year of retrenchment than anything else.
But doesn't your 1968 parallel actually predict that? Because, I mean, in a way, the end result of 1968 in Czechoslovakia took, 20 more years to come to fruition. I mean, as we're reminded by Havel's funeral today.
Yeah.
And, of course, I think if you and I had been teenagers in 1968 instead of the tiny babies that we in fact were, those folks were not very happy with how 1968 turned out for them either. So in a way, there was an immediate period of retrenchment, and the longer-term consequences took a lot longer to play out, and played out in really disparate ways.
Yeah.
Just as, I agree with you that it's wrong to conflate Occupy Wall Street and what happened in Tunisia equally. I mean, what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and what happened, at Berkeley in 1968. Right,
exactly. So no, so in that sense, I guess you're right. We can both be correct in that I suspect for the next couple of years you actually are going to see more of a retrenchment. But you're also correct that there might be sort of subterranean what's happened. I think the most interesting thing going into 2012 are, were the protests in Russia, and I cannot remember the name of the Chinese village. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do, but I cannot help you with
Hold on, I'm actually, going to look for the name. Wukong, there we go.
Yeah.
So, for Blogging Heads readers that probably are fully aware of this, in the case of Wukong, this was a small village that was being screwed over by various corrupt land deals by local party leaders. They eventually kicked out the party leaders. There was an attempt at police repression and the sort of capturing, and in one case, the death of sort of village leaders, at which point they then fought back and invited the international press in. And there now appears to be a sort of an accommodation of sorts. But still, this is highly unorthodox in terms of what's going on in China. And again, in Russia, the fact that you had similar protests, if nothing else, it's an interesting sort of wake-up call. Although I will say that I've seen political science arguments to the effect that these kinds of events might actually be useful in efficient authoritarian states, because this is a mechanism by which state elites can realize, oh wow, okay, we've been dropping the ball a little bit. We really need to step up on our game. So we've got this protest now. We have to move forward. And in some ways, this is really going to be, I think, going forward, an interesting test of how resilient not the Arab authoritarian states are, but rather Russia and China, which are the big boys, as it were.
Yeah, and the Russians in particular, who I know better, have been very, very good at letting the air out of the system. And one of the real sort of challenges of the Russian case is, although they're much more of a formal democracy than China is, there really is no political alternative at this point that could garner any kind of sort of significant or sufficient national support to pose an electoral challenge. So it really is, sort of a question of, as you say, how they manage the managed democracy.
Right.
Where in China, with the leadership, I mean, the one thing I would say about China is that you do have, what's the statistic on how many protests you have somewhere in China every day?
It's a lot. I mean, it's like in the hundreds.
Yeah. So this is, as the Chinese leaders are fully aware, the place at some level is, seething is probably too strong, but bubbling all the time. And so watching next year how the party leadership decides to react to that and what they think the best course is, and also something that you'll maybe have smarter predictions on than I will, what happens to the Chinese economy next year?
That's a huge question. But I mean, on the protest thing, it's been pointed out by a lot of China experts, and I think Ian Johnson has something in the New York Review of Books, that that data actually comes from the Chinese authorities themselves, and they do have a political incentive sometimes in issuing those kinds of statements for two reasons. First, at the international level, it's useful in sort of pointing out, look, we've got problems of our own. Quit asking us to do things like revalue our currency. And second, in a sort of battle between authorities in Beijing and, let's say, provincial authorities, sometimes that sort of data or playing up those kinds of protests is often a prelude to the central authority launching some kind of political campaign as a way of cracking down against particular provincial authorities. But that said, you're right about the economy. That's really the big question. And, it's funny. I've for the last year or two, I've been on the Chinese bubble is going to burst sort of kick, and I'm hardly the only one. There's a lot of people like, Nouriel Roubini and James Chanos and others have made this point. You're starting to see, real estate in places like Wenzhou just, sort of pop. And Bloomberg actually had a great story about a week ago on the extent of sort of Chinese loans to promote this kind of real estate. And there's going to be a really interesting question of, can they manage the popping of this bubble in a sort of soft landing way versus not? And I'm beginning to wonder if they actually can manage it. I was skeptical about this, but they now seem to have turned on the monetary taps again, recognizing that inflation isn't quite that much of a problem. So, and the other interesting thing is, in some ways, China next year is going through the same thing that we are in the form of a leadership change. And there's part of me that wonders if you're going to start seeing some kind of political business cycle in China where the leadership is going to try to pump up the economy as a way of smoothing out the transfer of power. So it might be that if there's a problem in China, it's not next year; it's more like 2013 or 2014.
Yeah, and I think it's worth sort of spotlighting the potential consequence in international politics of that as well, which is that China plays less of a role than is hoped for. Let's say on things like re-spurring the global economy,
yeah.
North Korea. Other areas where it's looked to play a helpful role in 2012 because so much attention is refocused internally.
I mean, I think the attention is going to be focused internally no matter what. In some ways, it doesn't matter whether China has a soft landing or not. I think that is a...
Well, I was actually thinking about the leadership transition and not
Yeah.
even so much the economy.
No, but I mean, you're right about the leadership transition, and in that sense, you could argue Kim Jong Il's death was particularly badly timed for them. I mean, it's worth talking about North Korea because I was thinking about this morning that North Korea presents one of those true ethical quandaries of world politics in the following sense. You could argue that all of the major actors in involved, the United States, South Korea, China, I mean, those are the big three, actually have a vested interest in the status quo in the sense of North Korea staying North Korea and not doing anything. Admittedly, not proliferating, but besides that, North Korea not really changing all that much. South Korea doesn't want to have to be in a situation where North Korea collapses because it's deathly afraid of any kind of reunification because it would be even more expensive than what happened in Germany. The Chinese obviously don't want to lose their buffer state of North Korea, and to some extent the United States I think doesn't want any kind of instability in the region. And you can argue that there are a fair number of North Koreans that actually don't want to see it, based on the amount of crying they had with the passing of Kim Jong Il, don't necessarily want to see the situation change. But, this is just horrible for most North Koreans.
Well, the question, I mean, it seems to me there's only a moral dilemma if you can figure out an efficacious way to make it less horrible for most North Koreans
Right.
that you're not pursuing.
Yeah.
I mean, and it seems to me that actually the most moral route in terms of thinking about both the quality of life of North Koreans and the peace of the region is that what you want is slow change. Because, I mean, you also sort of skipped over, saying, well, the U.S. and South Korea don't mind if North Korea stays as it is as long as it doesn't proliferate.
Right.
And that appears to, it can't stay as it is and not proliferate. It has to change in order to not proliferate. So you're actually not talking about a status quo situation.
No,
At the very minimum, you're talking about a status quo minus.
No, I mean, so you're right. In some ways, the best change, oddly enough, the best change would be, I think from the perspective of everyone, is if North Korea goes the way of China, which is, say, if North Korea starts launching economic reforms that would actually invite significant amounts of Chinese investment, this would accomplish a number of things. First, it reduces North Korea's incentive to proliferate because they might be getting rich in other ways. Second, it actually reassures China because if North Korea is economically dependent on them, they're not going to be worried about them deciding to reunify with South Korea necessarily. And potentially, if North Korea grows, then it allows South Korea to not fret as much. The thing is that I'm not sure the North Korean elite actually wants that.
Well, I spent some time earlier this week with a couple of guys who had traveled in North Korea fairly recently on humanitarian missions, and then sort of previous to that on the light water reactor project more than a decade ago.
Oh, wow.
But that they had been there in the last couple of years and were commenting that, and this you can see this video over at the Center for National. Why am I blanking on what the P stands for? This is very embarrassing. Anyway, we'll put up the link.
Okay.
Center for National Policy website. But one of the things they were commenting on was how much U.S. view of North Korea had gotten stuck in sort of the worst of the famine stage, and that on the one hand, people are thin and there's still malnutrition and kids are clearly stunted. On the other hand, there are now 800,000 cell phones in the country with 2 networks and a huge intranet, and a significant discussion among elites about whether to allow the intranet to have access to the internet for anyone other than Kim Jong-il to watch movies. And one guy told just a mind-blowing story of going to an upper-level English class at the prestige university in Pyongyang.
Yeah.
And walking into a classroom where the exercise they were doing was watching clips from Survivor and getting up and debating which characters should be allowed to stay on the show, and specifically whether one character who had an engineering background but also a felony conviction was more of a risk to the collective or an advantage for the collective.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and I mean, this is not the image that most Americans, even elite Americans, have of what life, and it's not like that if you live in a farm village in North Korea.
Right.
but it's just not nearly as cut off from the world anymore as we perceive it as being, and that makes a significant difference when you think about what the future could look like and how fast it could change.
That's that's a compelling anecdote. I think the question I have, and this is one of the issues. It might be that North Korea is not cut off from the rest of the world, but the rest of the world still remains somewhat cut off from North Korea.
Yes, that's exactly the line that was used.
So, that's nice.
And actually, it was particularly that the U.S. is more cut off from North Korea than North Korea is from the rest of the world, which is an interesting, and which is a real policy problem.
Yeah, although, it's not like, the thing I was struck by with Kim Jong-il's death is that, South Korea didn't know about it for approximately 48 hours. So, it's not like the and you would expect them to have at least somewhat, marginally better intel on this issue. But, let me put it this way, that's an interesting, possible path for North Korea to take. I'm still somewhat dubious that that'll actually happen. On the other hand, I think I blogged about this, we have no clue how North Korea is going to evolve. Again,
I don't think they have much of. Not that I know anything either, but it doesn't give a sign of being, and at a transition moment in particular, of being a state that has kind of a clear plan.
Yeah.
But which also suggests that we have scope to influence how it evolves, which is not the way. Again, it's not the way that we usually think about North Korea policymaking.
No, that's a fair point. Well, sort of looking forward to 2012. In some ways, what was shocking about this year was the places where you saw instability. You would not have predicted that the Euro crisis would have gotten as bad as it did, and you certainly wouldn't have predicted what would have happened in the Middle East. So going forward, do you think there is going to be a new region or, hotspot that is on no one's radar now, but will pop up in 2012?
I have to say, I had two things that I always say when asked that question to try to appear incredibly
Sage.
Smart.
Yes.
And North Korea was one of them, so that's now been spoiled. And you're asking me to reveal my other one to the entire Blogging Heads audience, but I will. And it is that Hugo Chavez dies.
Oh, okay, that's a good one.
Because there's very little, there's not much infrastructure around him.
Mm-hmm.
And so while for a long time the Venezuelan army tried to stay out of politics, it's rather unclear, there'd be a vacuum, and it's rather unclear who would fill it.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say there are a lot of parties who'd be interested in filling it, and it would also rapidly become a very hot topic in American politics.
Yes, that's true.
And it would cause sort of interesting friction with Colombia as well. So that's my off the radar prediction.
My off the radar prediction will actually is in a similar region. I would go with the Castros. An interesting question is what happens if the either Fidel or Raul were to pass from the scene. And then would there be any change? My hunch is there would be far less change than is commonly expected, but it does raise that would also prompt a fair amount of debate in the U.S. Domestic side of things.
The Castro angle that I've heard that's interesting is that on the one hand, Fidel has devolved a lot of power, so there's actually more stability in Cuba than in Venezuela.
Right.
On the other hand, the sort of sentimental attachments through which the Cubans do so much for the region, what would happen if that started to change?
That would be interesting.
And similarly, by the way, with Chavez and the cheap oil.
Right, to Cuba, exactly. So, in some ways, the two are related. If one, this was relatively a quiet year for Latin America, so it does seem, by the law of averages, there should be a regression to the mean, and maybe we'll expect more out of that.
Yep. Oh, I've actually got another Latin America sleeper story for American politics.
Yes.
Which is that about a month ago, the Chilean government put in an extradition request for an American who was serving on active duty as a military attaché in the embassy just after Pinochet's death. And actually they want to charge him in connection with the killings of a couple of American citizens, including the case that was the subject of the movie Missing. And that, there was one article in the New York Times and there was no further coverage of it. And the guy was active duty, was working at the embassy, and so presumably you can argue both that he had diplomatic immunity and that he would, if anyone were going to charge him, it would be our military through courts martial,
Right.
and that the status of forces agreement, whatever status of forces agreement we had with Chile, would have covered that. But if that comes into the news at some point in 2012, that will have sort of amazing and fascinating repercussions.
Okay, that is a good story. We got to talk about the U.S. election, obviously. So the other.
Do we have to?
You at least have to make a prediction. So and it's been you want to talk about unpredictable or fluid. Certainly that this race qualifies. Who do you think winds up getting the nomination?
I still think Romney gets it, just because I don't think there's someone else that can take it away. I'm fully prepared. I'll enjoy going back and looking at this clip and laughing at myself, if not. But I just don't. It's not so much that I don't see Romney losing it, but with Gingrich's numbers starting to fall, I don't see who comes and takes it away from Romney.
The only one that I can actually see, I mean, here's the problem. There are multiple ways I can see Romney failing. There is no one, it's sort of the Tina problem, which is there an alternative?
Right.
And I can see Romney constantly being, weakened and not quite closing the deal. But it's not obvious to me that there's going to be, any coalescing around a viable alternative. But I'm wary about this because back in 2008, I made all these predictions, and the only one I got wrong was Romney. I said Obama would win the nomination at this point, back then, and I said Obama would win the presidency. And my prediction at this point would be, I would have to say I think it'll be Romney too, and I also think that if Romney gets it, my hunch is he wins the presidency as well. I don't think the economy is going to be in a great enough shape by November or really in some ways by the fall for Obama to do terribly well. But
I don't think that the Republicans can get their act together to take advantage of that, and I think that Obama still has a good chance at squeaking through. I
think he's got a chance. No, I will say I'm more optimistic about his prospects than I was 3 months ago. But my assumption is that this is sort of the low point in terms of the assessing the state of the GOP. We're talking, even though this isn't going to be released for a little while, this week the GOP House caved on the 2-month-old payroll tax or 2-month payroll tax extension, and God knows I don't think the GOP presidential candidates have exactly covered themselves with glory over the fall. But I'm assuming by the time that a nominee is picked, if we go back to '92, they were called the Seven Dwarfs at this point. So it's remarkable how winning suddenly burnishes your stature a little bit, and I'm assuming that if Romney actually starts winning things, then suddenly he's going to be just perceived that in a different way.
I just want to point out that every single one of those dwarves from 1992 looks like a statesman by current standards. I mean, you're absolutely right about the perception of the field in '92, but I'm unconvinced. I'm unconvinced that Mitch McConnell now and Boehner now have the situation under control. Let's just put it that way. But we'll. You and I will figure out some way of having a reunion to check ourselves on this.
This is true, yes. Man, I think a year from now we should just, we can actually watch, we'll have to watch this again and then just cringe multiple times at the
Unless we've both moved to New Zealand.
Oh man, that would be awesome. That would be great. And the only other prediction the only other thing I'm worried about is really whether the Europe situation gets worse.
And make a prediction on that, please. That's likely to be much more embarrassing than the U.S. presidential.
Yeah, this is going to be embarrassing because I think I'm going to be more optimistic than I would have been even 2 weeks ago. But it looks like the sort of implicit quid pro quo between sort of the fiscal deal that was made about 10 days ago, and then earlier this week the ECB loaned something like $500 billion worth out, or 500 billion euro worth out. To banks, and the obvious implication is that the banks will then use that to buy up sovereign debt because they can then take that, go to the ECB window, and get more euros from it. So as a result, it's sort of a backdoor way through which the ECB can actually at least alleviate the stresses for sovereign governments trying to borrow. So that might actually lessen sort of at least acute market pressure on some of these.
But if I read Krugman right, it's already helping in Spain. It's not helping everywhere, but it's clearly helping in Spain.
No, it's helping in Spain, and it might help in Italy. I mean, I think the thing is, I think Greece is still screwed, and so the question really, and also what we haven't seen yet is the actual real economy effects of the sort of uncertainty that's happened this past fall. So, European growth is almost zero. And if that continues, then it could potentially worsen the problem. And, of course, and again, I'm doing this in real time as I'm thinking, so I haven't given that much prior thought to this.
Viewers, observe.
Observe as I get more pessimistic, literally by the second. The other thing is that it assumes that this fiscal deal that was hashed out at the summit actually, comes into force. And I'm a little skeptical about that, too. So, you know what? It might be the same sort of play of what happened this year, where the first couple of months, things sort of continue to muddle along, and then, we have a serious nosedive again. So, yeah, now that I think about it, I don't think the Europeans are going to get through 2012 without another sort of acute crisis of, Italy having to borrow at higher than 7% and things like that again.
So moving south from Europe to the Middle East, we can predict that there will be more elections which will be won by political Islamists, which will produce more hysteria in the United States, which will result in more efforts to cut funds, which would assist democratic transitions, shore up and moderate political actors in those countries, further squeezing things tighter. The Israelis will get more anxious. I think there will not be an attack on Iran, just because I think there's been too much talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that particularly the debate in Israel has actually sort of pushed the window for action shut. But I think that will, on the one hand, there won't be an attack on Iran. On the other hand, there won't be a significant breakthrough on the peace process. So I don't think that it'll be a year of interesting and hopefully some really significant forward-moving action within individual countries and the sort of ugly stalemate regionally.
I mean, I will say that I don't necessarily.
Of course, I could have said that last year too. Look how dumb I'd look.
Yeah, I will say this. I think this year is going to be a really interesting test for how our, for how our theories of world politics works. Because in some ways, the real question is whether or not having these countries as democracies actually causes them to recalculate what their national interests are. So do they? For example, do these countries continue to view Iran as a threat or not? And I think one of the really interesting, false predictions so far was the claim that Iran was going to massively exploit the Arab Spring as a way of sort of augmenting its own power. And I think
Iran would have liked to do that.
Oh, sure, they would have liked to do it. I mean, there's no denying that. I'm willing to acknowledge that. It's just that they didn't. And in fact, they failed miserably. I mean, in part because I think they didn't anticipate what would happen to Syria. And in part because the way Syria played out actually led to a breach between Turkey and Iran that I don't think they necessarily counted on either. Not to mention the fact that, it's worth remembering, in January there was a real protest in Iran as well, and this caught them by surprise.
Right. Well, the other thing it's worth remembering is that I think they thought they could ally themselves as the ally of people who were fighting corrupt autocrats,
right.
Sort of not understanding that they were correctly perceived also to be corrupt autocrats.
Right, exactly. So, I'm with you in terms of, I don't think there's going to be an attack on Iran just because I don't think the Obama administration is going to go there. Although I was amused, there was some very neocon site, or some posting at the American Thinker, I think, suggesting that in fact Obama was going to attack Iran just so he could get elected. Which you gotta love that kind of logic.
I fearlessly predict that will not happen.
Yeah, okay. And, I also don't, all right, I think we should close with this. Do you think Bashir Assad is still going to be in power a year from now? I think that's really that's actually a contingent prediction where it's not clear what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. I've been struck by the number of people very confidently saying Bashir Assad's days are numbered.
Yeah.
And I certainly wish that were the case, but I don't detect anywhere sort of how that is going to happen. Mm-hmm. Because I don't see a coherent plan for how it's done internationally, sort of Libya option. I don't see the ability for it to happen internally. You would think that if people close to him were going to decide that he needed to go, that would have happened. So I'm concerned that that'll be a lot more protracted and awful. And I think there's a sort of Zimbabwe-esque scenario there that I really worry about.
It's interesting. I think in some ways, the two parallels are Zimbabwe or, frankly, Cote d'Ivoire, where, Cote d'Ivoire was a case where sanctions really did have a dramatic effect, and eventually led to the cracking of the regime. And you can argue.
Well, I would disagree. I mean, I'm not sure, but what we'd still have a standoff in Cote d'Ivoire if it hadn't been for Libya, which then made it okay for the French to go in and back up the UN peacekeepers so that the military forces loyal to the actual elected government could push.
Let me put it this way. The sanctions alone didn't do it. I agree with you on that. But you can argue that the sanctions set up the conditions such that a really very modest use of force was required. Right. Whereas had that been attempted, let's say 18 months ago, it would have been much more serious. In some ways, that's an interesting template, I think, for what might happen with Syria. Which is, you're right. I think in the end, Assad doesn't go unless there is some actor willing to use at least a gesture of force to sort of push him aside. But it might be the case that 6 months from now, the Syrian army is sufficiently depleted in terms of its ranks, and Syrian coffers are sufficiently depleted, such that Turkey doesn't necessarily have to do all that much to force at least Assad out and have some sort of power transition.
Now, does Iran allow Syria's coffers to get that depleted, that Turkey can? Because that's a real. I mean, Turks have said to me, we're not going to be NATO's subcontractor on Syria. I mean, you could see circumstances that would change that, but that is a very, very significant regional power dynamic if the Iranians let that happen.
I would say two things on this. The first is that it might be that Turkey is too far down the road of opposing Assad to walk that back. So that's partly what I'm basing this on. And if that's not true, then I think you're right. The second is that Iran is under sanctions itself and is having its own issues with respect to things like hard currency reserves. So it would be you might be right, but I'm not sure how many resources they can afford to prop up Syria. And I mean, the fact that they've made statements to the effect of saying, listen, we're not happy with the sort of crackdown either, I do think are telling. But that said, if I was a sober, this is the difference between me being in government and not being in government. If I was in government, I think I would probably adopt your position on this, but I will take a little more of a risk and say Assad will not be in power a year from now.
Well, let us hope not.
Yes.
And let us hope that Blogging Heads has a renaissance.
Oh, yes.
That we figure out ways to continue this debate from time to time in fora where we can interact with all of the wonderful commentators that we've come to know, and if not love, at least respect over the years.
I was going to say respect and chuckle as I read the comments, yes.
No, but some of you guys are huge fans, and that's been very, everything I've learned about media, I started out practicing in this format, long before I was a star of minor shows on Fox. So thank you very much to everyone who's made us the superstars that we are. And what an incredible year it's been to all of you.
Yeah, and I will say, again, wish all the Blogging Heads viewers a happy 2012, and I will wish Bob Wright, good luck at his new position at The Atlantic. And Slate, I believe. And also a thank you to Sang No, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Sang is the sort of technical person who always sends us the helpful email reminders to shut down our computers prior to doing the Blogging Heads, which I then ignore anyway. But, it hasn't run into a problem. And, he's done a fantastic job on the technical side of things, making this much easier. I mean, it says something about the pace of technology that 5 years ago when I was doing this for the first time, I had the bulky tripod with the video camera set up, and now I'm just sort of doing this to the camera and the laptop.
Okay, so now you've encouraged me. I still don't. It's actually ironically in the new year I'm probably going to get a calendar in the laptop, but I'm going to pick up my camera and show the audience my setup because it is functionally the same. Observe the stack of books. That's my tripod.
Oh God.
That's my computer.
Okay,
That's
I'm going to go for
telephone.
Yeah.
As you see, my headset broke down today, which is another good sign that it might be time to get out of this business. But that is functionally the same setup that I had in my spare bedroom in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when I started doing Blogging Heads before we ascended to the heights of the generous corner office of the National Security Network.
I will. You know what? I'm just too embarrassed. I can't show the viewers my office at this point because I'm in the last throes of grading at this point, and you know what? All right, I will show very briefly.
Yeah.
This is what a messy. This is what a messy office looks like. Let's see over there. Yes. Okay.
Uh-oh, viewers, I think we lost.
Yeah, that's what happens when you have like 100
so
of these
messy,
things
swallowed him up.
that you're trying
Dan,
to grade.
are you there?
Heather?
Well, Happy New Year, everyone.